And we are live. Hello and
The
welcome to
powers of life be.
the tech is working. Although heads up to everyone, there is currently like heavy rain and thunder outside my apartment, and I would not be like surprised if the power ends up going out at some point. Heavy wind too. So if the stream goes down, don't worry. It's just a natural disaster happening outside my door. No big deal.
It has been a very strange time, I think, weather-wise in the last couple of days. I know in Ontario over here we've been apparently having like funnel cloud warnings. So if suddenly you see like I don't know, like a big like whirlwind and I just vanish in like a weird suction motion, a natural disaster just happened on my end, which I guess is like almost adjacent to sort of some of the themes that we're talking today, considering we're
Uh,
talking about lore and I guess natural disasters and environmental conditions is all part of building lore.
Well, we have an entire event deck for yeah, for exactly this like random thing. And at some point, we're still nailing down the exact details of some of the later streams. But world breaking, breaking your world apart using the events deck is on the agenda possibly for later. But we've set out a sort of provisional schedule. We've announced the first four. Things that we're doing with the deck. You can see those on the main page of our project at storyenginedeck.com/lore. But if you have a particular feature that you'd like to see or a stream that you'd want to see us go into a deep dive on a topic, let us know in the comments. We will definitely be paying attention to that, and we can sort of adjust or cherry pick for our schedule. Yeah, so
If I was
definitely.
super smart, I would have like made a poll or discussion board about it. But here we are. But it's okay. Put it in the comments. We obviously will have an opportunity to read through them. And of course, Peter, we have Eric from who is our community manager, always joining in and taking over all our story engine socials. So he'll certainly have an opportunity to share all of that as well. We have a very cool subject to bring up to you today. And Peter, as I was preparing for the segment, because obviously I think this is one of the ones where your creativity will truly shine, not only as the designer of Lore Master's deck and the one who's kind of the mastermind behind all your creature creation, but I had this moment of parallel thought, like, the idea that creatures are such another thing that adds so much depth to a world, and you could take a moment to really consider a lot of the kind of like ecological, environmental elements, like kind of the anthropomorphic elements that lead into the creation. And for me, I had this moment because we did this, a live stream about wine of last week, and during that one, I was kind of spending this moment telling them, like, guys, like, it's more than just wine. There's the land and the terroir and how things are growing. And I'm like, creatures is very much like that. So I'm super excited to dive into creatures today. I know we're already having a lot of questions coming in from our audiences, and please do keep them coming in. Do we want to take a really quick moment to kind of answer some of the questions that are coming in, or do you want to dive right into creatures? Because I know maybe some of you are joining us for the very first time and you may have questions about the deck that obviously we would be more than happy to answer for you. We encourage everyone to participate in our discussion boards. I know we've shared a lot of our answers on them as well, and please feel free to scroll through. And we have been regularly updating our FAQ to the best of our abilities to answer questions for you if we don't always get a chance to on the live stream. And of course, always drop us a message. You can always message us on socials, leave it in the discussion board. We answer as many as we can. So without further ado, I guess, Peter, do we want to answer just a quick couple of questions before we dive into I guess, like creature diving into creatures, and maybe take a quick moment to just share with anyone who's joining us for the first time what the Lore Masters deck is all about?
Yeah, of course. So the Lore Masters deck is a project that we're currently crowdfunding on BackerKit. You can find the details at storyenginedeck.com/lore, and we'll have that little link in the banner here. And it's a deck of cards for creating lore for fictional worlds. So you can start with a few card draws and slowly build out. You might start with by creating one faction, and then through these creative prompts on the cards, you'll be able to create your own ideas for a faction, and then say the leader of that faction, who that leader is. And if that leader is from a particular location in the world, like what's their hometown like? And if that hometown happens to have like a particular creature that lives there, that's like the bird that everyone knows is always like clustering in the town square, that type of bird, you can create details about the bird or another kind of like animal that's like an urban animal. And from learning about that creature, you can find out how that creature may have been behind an event like an epidemic or a plague that was animal carried. And from there, from that event, you can so on and so on. You can keep on spinning out additional bits of lore that connect your whole world. And it's really fun for coming up with these world building elements that you're mapping, not in terms of like space and where they exist in the world relative to each other, but in terms of like their causal relationships, what connects them to their backgrounds, what connects them through current events, in what ways do they depend on or influence each other in this world. And I think that the creatures deck is a really fun lens to look at that through, because one of the ways that I've talked about the lore masters deck a few times is that it's very much turning your lore into an ecosystem. It's seeing kind of like the web of nature, like how each thing connects to each other thing and what those relationships are like. And they can be very complex relationships. And with the creatures deck in particular, it was one of the first decks that I created before I realized that what I wanted to do was make this larger apparatus for creating lore. I'd started kind of just with the creatures deck as its own standalone thing. And I realized really quickly that like creatures are a food source, a resource source. They are the environment. We are creatures, right? Like I think we forget that people are creatures and that we developed all of our biological apparatus was developed in relationship and response to other living things that were hunting us, that we were hunting, that we were foraging. Like our brains are very wired to our eyes, and our eyes are very wired for the fact that we lived as prey for a long time. Like it's just such an interesting story of who we are. But yeah, creatures can mean a lot of different things, and we can connect to them in a lot of different ways, and they can mean a lot of different things in worlds. I really think that the creatures are a fun lens to look at. What does an ecosystem of lore look like, literally and figuratively? What are the
Yeah.
different ways that creatures can fit into the world? So that's why I'm really excited about this topic. But let's do a couple quick questions off the top,
Yeah, and
and
also
then
I just want to see like quickly from Marlene too. She said she's bought all the PDFs for the previous deck and printed them and colored the icon. And this will be the first physical deck. Well, Marlene, thank you, first physical deck.
yeah, that's
Yay!
really
Thank you
exciting.
so much. Yeah,
We put a lot of work into the like physical production of it to make it really like beautiful and useful. I'm really glad that you'll get to experience that, because it's definitely it's a cool, like I've done a lot of like homemade decks of various levels of quality when I've been prototyping, and it's always fun. But there is like a really special thing about opening the physical deck and
yeah,
making it yours and busting it out. So I'm really excited that you'll get
yeah.
to experience that.
Yeah, and if you love the deck and want to share the word, please do like take an opportunity to maybe forward the link to someone who you think might be interested. It
Yeah,
it is your shares that honestly like help bring this project to life, and we are so grateful for your support. So if you love the deck and if you love our work, we'd really appreciate a social share. It honestly makes a very very big difference, like in
yeah,
communities like this. It is the community that really like kind of makes our world go around, so to
yeah.
say. So yeah, thank you so much. Actually, Peter, a funny story about that. I was speaking to a friend yesterday. He was saying how he was opening his dating app and matched with a girl, and when they were just chatting and bonding, she was saying how she was working on a story but was struggling with building a world for her deck, and he immediately was like, do I have the deck for you? And pointed her to the project, and she actually pledged. So
Whoa,
there
okay.
you go, the
Thank
power
you.
of social share. Yeah, I
Yeah.
know, thank you, and shout out to my friend to do that. So we have a question from Johannes, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I say anyone's names wrong on the stream. I don't have the ability to press like a little pronunciation button. I think that'd actually be a cool add-on. That's going to be my next $1 million project. So saying Johannes is saying, I often hear you, Peter, mention that you use the decks in conjunction with creating for D&D. I'm sure it'll work wonderfully, but have you tried using them with smaller RPGs?
So I have played other RPG systems, but not recently. So since basically creating the deck, I've pretty much only been playing D&D and a little bit of Emberwind. So while I can't say that I've road tested this, what I will say is that I do think it's very adaptable to smaller scale RPGs, where like maybe you're not doing a whole world, but where you're exploring one little corner of it, or where you're exploring like a more intimate story, like a character driven story. I still think that and this is where I think like Lore Master's deck probably shines more than Deck of Worlds for this kind of world building, because Deck of Worlds is very much like cities in these larger spaces and these larger worlds and how those cities relate to each other or areas relate to each other. Lore Master's deck can get really granular, right? Like you can start with a figure based prompt and figure out a character who this is going to be an NPC that the party is going to be interacting with. Um, and then from there you can build out the rest of the world and relationships, but they don't need to go see the whole thing, but they can see the way that the threads from other parts of the world might connect to this character. You know, if they're speaking longingly about their hometown that they haven't been able to to visit for a long time and describing this thing that they love about it, that becomes like a really cool character aspect. That becomes a really cool like emotional engine for that character that you can use to like make the party connect with them or understand their motivations. So it doesn't all have to be like a big giant epic D&D epic fantasy. We're going to level 20 and we're going to go slay a monster dragon. You can tell these smaller stories. And I think one thing that I like about Lore Master's deck that is really cool is that you can scale it down. Um, the events can be prompted in such a way that you think about them not as like cataclysmic events but like small local events.
Mhm.
You can decide that the storm was not a world-ending storm but like a small local storm that like you know changed the way that the town was because it destroyed something small. Like you can do these smaller stories, and I think it definitely scales down to that level. So yeah, I don't have specific experiences with that, but my instinct is that it's definitely very scalable, and it's just the lens that you're going to interpret the prompts through,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, I that's probably the best way that you would have described it, and I think that I would be someone who's a little bit more inclined to play small RPGs and larger RPGs. I mean, my D&D journey ended after I just like created my character because I just simply did not have the ability to commit to something as big and as epic as D&D. And I've kind of recognized the story engine deck's ability to get micro granular, which is what interests me. And I think it also has the opportunity to I guess like fanfic out art. I know some of the small RPG games maybe come with their own self-contained systems. Like I know one thing we spoke about is shout out to Gloomhaven, who I know who's doing exceptionally well and funded their campaign, I think like sometime mid last week. So
Yeah,
congratulations
two
to
mil and
them.
climbing. Congratulations.
Yeah, yeah, amazing, amazing. And I remember kind of looking at their system, and they are a very self-contained built system. But that doesn't mean you don't have the opportunity to create, like, add your own spin and flair to something that is self-contained. And that was where I saw like connections with the lore masters deck. I'm like, oh, you can actually still build something for yourself, and in some ways, fanfic, I guess, your world a little bit because we all want to put our own unique spin onto something. One other question that just came in from Jesse: would there be any plans to release a spreadsheet or digital version of the deck that could be imported into a VTT for random world events, etc.? I think I sort of know the answer to that. For the foreseeable future, likely not. And it's not for a lack of desire for all the big grandoise plans that we've had out there. I know we've had a few requests about putting out apps and the like. And trust me, these are thoughts that we have. And I think it's just like we are a very small team, and there's only certain things we can do at a certain time, and wanting to do it correctly and making sure that doesn't
Yeah,
come out with a lot of errors and mistakes, right?
yeah. Neither of us has done app development before, and so when we do it, we want to do it right. We want to make sure that we are thinking this through and not going in with that like anyone can make an app. Like this is like we care so much about the story engine deck and making sure that it like presents and plates right. It's the right experience for people, and translating that. I just want to make sure that yeah that we do it as correctly as we can. So it's definitely on the docket. Like I think we talk about it once every 3 months. Um, and like how and when we'd release it. But for now, it's definitely like it's not imminent path, but it's like it's very much on our minds a lot. But yeah, good
It's yeah.
question.
Yeah, it's on our minds. Maybe if you guys share it enough or indicate that it's something that people want, it'll like
Yeah,
push us. There's nothing like some good healthy peer pressure to move us in the direction of where we should be going.
yeah.
Well, I should we build some creatures?
Well, let's dive in and talk a little bit. I think about
Yeah.
I want to save so the format that I'm thinking about for some of these deep dive conversations is talking a little bit about I guess the theory of it first. And so this way, there's something
Mhm.
here where like even if someone's not picking up the lore master deck and they just want to learn about like what are some more interesting ways to think about creating a faction or creating a fantasy creature or whatever, we can share some of what we learned in creation of the deck and talk a little bit about like the theory of that kind of world building. And then yes, and then I'm desperately excited to I have three different types of creature prompts that I want to show you guys, and then we can do some co-building with Maroki. And we're going to do, I think, one creature that is just the standard flavor of how the deck works. We're going to do one sort of specific experiment that I've been trying about hybrid creatures, where you smash together two creature types. And then at the very end, we're going to do kind of the more this is still like I've not written out the rules for this in full. I've been doing these as sort of experimental notes, but creating a creature where you start to substitute cues drawn from the deck for intentional fixed cues. I've been calling them, where instead of finding out something from the deck, I really think this creature is connected to a faction. I'm going to draw a faction card and create a relationship between them. rather than it being a prompted relationship, I'm going to start with that idea in mind. And you can do that with any of the card types. All the card types can be used to substitute a cue, and we'll talk a little bit about how and when to do that. And especially if you decide to build a creature in isolation rather than in like a big web,
Mhm.
you can stack extra cues. You don't have to be limited to four. The four is what makes it work so that you're not overburdening any particular node in your web. But if you're just going to build one thing, you can do an even deeper dive, and you can like start to stack things on, and it gets fun and zany. And I want a chance to do that with you guys before to do that as like a live thing. So see
Yeah,
how it goes.
I always love actually personally I love watching you build cues. I find the way your mind works, and I think a lot of people who have previously known your works and are fans of your work enjoy seeing that creative process. So I'm excited to go through that with you. And I think you alluded to it a little bit, just sort of like why do creatures matter in storytelling and world building, right? You talked about the larger ecosystem. You talked about how you know, whether you consider it a food source, where does it live, how does it forage, is it part of an urban environment, is it part of um is it part of a rural environment, is there necessarily like a change in how the animal lives because maybe humans have moved in into their habitat. And maybe we can dive into that a little bit because I think like even when you were discussing about how we consider creatures and how we interact with them in interviews when you said are they a food source, and the entire time I was just too busy thinking about like giant creatures, right? Like my brain's like, yes, just big creatures. It already locked into the idea of just creatures being predators or being like something that's a fearful foe, or even like something in that kind of fantasy danger. They're like big boss energy, and then you're like, and
Big
then you can
boss
eat
energy. I
them.
love that. I love that.
And then I was like, and then you can eat them. And I was like, and then my brain like literally was like reconstructing creatures in my head. I'm like, all right, like these creatures too. And they're all one in the same in some ways, right? You can't just completely say, well, this small creature that could be farmed or even or hunted in the wild lives in the same world as a creature that's also like the foe, like, and you can't completely ignore the two. And those are actually questions that I poke holes in when I'm reading or when I'm watching shows. I mean, it's funny, I think the most obvious one that I question regularly is Pokemon.
I was gonna say the exact same thing.
Like whenever I'm watching Pokemon and they're, everyone has these like relationships, these Pokemon are like very sentient. I'm like, but do they eat them? And then it's funny because there's literally one. If all of us were part of the OG Pokemon 150,
Yeah.
Farfetch'd,
Yeah,
there's like one.
Farfetch'd. I was gonna bring up. I literally before you even mentioned Pokemon, it was in my head to talk about the Farfetch'd lore and the leak and the whole. Yeah, you
Yeah,
please,
I'm like
please.
one. Yeah, like one Pokemon, literally one Pokemon in the entire Pokedex. They talk about it being hunted for food, and then I feel like that immediately opens a plethora of questions. Going, do you not hunt anyone else for food? If you're eating Farfetch, why would you not eat like a Pidgey or Pidgeotto? Why is it just Farfetch? And like, what a strange phenomena it is. And then I remember when I watched the cartoon, they would like there would be images of Pokemon, and then I remember one time seeing an ocean view, and it was just fish, like regular old fish, and I'm like, so is there like the
Non Pokemon animals. Yeah.
the non-Pokemon animals that we eat, and then the Pokemon animals? I have so many questions, guys. So yeah, I since clearly you were thinking about Farfetch'd as well, I want to hear what your thoughts are, Farfetch'd, in the world of Pokemon and in creature building contexts.
Well, it's really interesting. I don't think that we realize how culturally we see animals. I think we think of them as like they are like animals exist in the world. They're these biological entities, and they're very different from us, and they are what they are. And we immediately become inobservant to assumptions like which animals are food and which are friends, right? Like on a zoomed out moral level, there is nothing particularly worse about like eating a dog compared to eating a different animal. Um, Other than perhaps the argument about like which animals most perceive their own existence and therefore like notice that they are not alive anymore, and those are big philosophical questions that are interesting. I love my dog and would never eat him, and I instinctively have a moral response to hearing about like, oh, dogs is food. But like culturally speaking, that is just a lens that I grew up with and a set of assumptions that I grew up with that are not facts about the world. They're just really, really strong feelings and assumptions that I have in relationships that are too deeply wired for me to change, but that I can at least step back and recognize, like, oh, that is a specific relationship that I have with my dog, and I love my dog like he is a person. I really, really do. But I can't expect everyone to be that way. So those categories of like which animals do we think of as like animals, which are pets, is interesting, which are friends. That whether or not we consider ourselves to be animals is also a really interesting question. I think we often exclude ourselves from the animal kingdom, even though as a species, we are uh, or I mean, depending on where you look at draw the line in evolutionary history, like we're millions of years old, and most of the time that we have spent being a species, we have spent not like we are now, right? Like humans in the modern world are such a short time span compared to the longer story of how our bodies were made and how our brains were made and what they were meant for. So, how do we think of ourselves as animals or creatures? It's an interesting question. And then originally it was called the species deck, and I ended up calling it the creatures deck because I did want to be a bit more evocative with fantasy, and I didn't want to get too locked into the like evolutionary biology perspective, which is only one way of seeing the world, and I didn't want to invest too much in that. But I did want to remember that creatures also include like wine comes from grapes grown on vines, and vines are a species; they're a creature. The deck is this is a question we're going to talk a little bit about later about like how the deck is designed. But the deck is designed so that pretty much only two of the options are like traditional land animals, and then there's usually one kind of water ecosystem organism and one I guess what you call like a non-traditional organism, not necessarily plants, but also like funguses or microorganisms or other things that are creatures that could have a really interesting place to fit in your world or story to tell in your world that we often just like forget about because they're static or because our relationship with them is different from those of animals. But they're like one of my favorite paragraphs about why plants matter is actually from the Jurassic Park novel. Ellie Sadler, the plant biologist who is the one that we see examining the Triceratops poop in the movie. Um, she has this really brilliant set of paragraphs where she's like thinking about and talking about how people just see like plants as a background in the world and not like a living part that shapes the ecosystem. There are like great arguments for the fact that plants have domesticated humans, right? That like one of the most successful organisms on the planet is wheat because wheat trained people to grow it. It rewarded us for growing it in a way that like it became very successful and we now take care of it. Like some could say that plants are winning from an evolutionary goals perspective. So I think that really looking at like what are creatures, what are the relationships between them, how do they connect to each other is really worthwhile. And I think that like it really makes sense to not think of your animals or your plants or any of the species that inhabit your world as just background or window dressing. They are very much part of your world. They determine the local resources that people have if they use animal-based resources, which most resources are animal or plant-based in some way. Um, they're going to dictate diet. They're going to become very cultural in terms of like what an animal means. Like we instinctively understand rats as disease bearers, and beyond just the facts of what of the hygienic risk that a rat poses, there's also like a moral dimension that like rats are now associated with these things. When you call someone a rat, it means these things. And thinking about like what is the cultural dimension or the cultural meaning of an animal is important. Yeah, so they can
I'm
be yeah
gonna
yeah
to interrupt what you were saying about the
no.
rats thing too, I actually very recently the net there's this like one nat like natural TikToker real guy that I follow. I love watching how he describes things because he calls orcas murder Oreos, and amongst other interesting little analogies. And he actually was speaking about how apparently rats they've proven that rats did not spread the plague, but it's kind of like the history, the cultural association with rats. It's like we've not been able to undo it after many years of just like one kind of misguided assumption that people made, right? So when you were just talking about like the cultural affiliation of people see, of rats, it's largely incorrect, and that actually has an element towards lore building as well, right? Like it's like there's an affiliation that we can associate to something, and it could be completely misguided and not
yeah.
even true at all. I like how we have this fellowship at the table saying did we say vines are creatures? I mean they
I
could.
said what I said. What was I gonna say? Yeah, for sure. And like wolves are another great example of an animal that in like medieval France came to mean so many different things that weren't true about it. It did, wolves did pose a threat, but the fear of them became so disproportionate to the threat that they were hunted to extinction. Um,
And if we think
uh,
about bears,
yeah,
like when I hike the mountains, and I've gone and hiked in the Tonkin Valley out of Jasper towards Alberta and BC, people are afraid of bears, right? Everyone talks about bears. And I think they said statistically there's only really one bear attack every 7 years. However, there's hundreds of caribou and moose attacks and elk attacks every year because everyone thinks they're cute reindeer and they literally put their children in front of them to pose for photos when they're all angry and horny during rutting season. Like, terrible idea. That's my PSA to anyone ever looking to hike the mountains or going out in the wild. Do not approach the elk. They are not cute like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer types. They actually are very much more dangerous than a bear who's frankly usually like does not want to deal with humans whatsoever.
Yeah, and again, we start to tell stories about the personalities that animals have that are not proportionate to the actual experiences with them, because there's so much more like lore, like real world stories about animals than there are actual experiences with them. And
Mm-hmm.
that disconnect is really interesting. Like animal myths, like people believing things that like I think there was a long standing thing from literally back to ancient Greece. I think that like um, beavers, I think, would chew off their own testicles and then leave them behind as bait to escape animals. Was never true. That's never been a thing. But it was believed for thousands of years because like one Greek authority on the world who heard this secondhand wrote it down. So yeah, like, and again, the story of an animal versus the reality of an animal is another really interesting dichotomy. So that's actually that brings us kind of into the next question we're going to talk about, which is how do you design an effective creature? And I think it's to pick different angles for your different creatures to look at not just what they are, but what they mean in the world. And so, like, one of the cues in the deck is that there is a misconception about this animal. So remembering that, like,
Oh.
it's not just what it is, but what it means that is really interesting. Some of the things that I think are really interesting questions to ask about an animal, and this is where the reason that I like the deck is that it helps you focus on like asking maybe 2 to 4 of these questions. I think asking all of these questions about every creature is one of those things where you end up spending too much time doing preparatory thinking and not enough time writing. So there is a diminishing returns point about like how much depth you go into designing an animal. But some of the things you might think about are like how does it get food? And so that's both what is its food source? What does it eat? Is it a carnivore, an omnivore, a detritivore? Does it feed on energy? Does it like especially when as you get into fantasy, does it eat a material instead of another organism? Those are all really interesting questions. And then also, what apparatus does it have on its body for getting that? An anteater eats ants. We know that from the name, but you can look at that thing. You can look at that nose and be like, that probably sticks its nose in holes to get things. Like that's a good thing getting nose. So the apparatus of the body, like how does it get food through into its face? Actually, that's a great question that I'll get to in a second. Great question from Fellowship of the Tables on YouTube. So the apparatus of its face is designed that way. And then also, like, what style of hunting does it do? Is it a pack hunter, a solo hunter, ambush hunter? Does it use webs, traps? Is it stationary? Is it mobile? Is it a sprint hunter or a like marathon hunter? Like these are all different styles of hunting that determine what a creature's body is going to be like and what kind of prey it can successfully feed on. And you can start from the end of like what is its body like and what prey does that mean, or we can start with what prey does it have and then what might its body look like to be able to pursue those prey.
I'm
Other
broad.
yeah.
I have these particular memories of science class in grade 9 where we were tasked to design and draw an alien that like represented the planet it came from. So it was sort of like a reverse where we were
Oh
already given
yeah.
the conditions like Jupiter, gaseous planet, very high gravity, very, toxic atmosphere. What would you do, right? Or like, and so, some people draw like really squat creatures because it's like that's how you do not overcome gravity and
Yeah.
and like kind of working in sluggish environments. And actually, one of the things when you were talking about whether creatures, if you're leaning in a fantasy element, they would eat materials and stuff. I think this is where and I know I'm burying the lead and jumping the gun a little bit, but that's where I see something like the Lore Masters deck. And I think this is where I hope people will really recognize the value in the Lore Masters deck, because sometimes we don't, the original story engine deck was all about overcoming writer's block. And I think the kind of like further the further statement I would make to that is that the story engine deck of world and Lore Masters deck also offer prompts and thoughts that we may not necessarily conceptualize ourselves,
Yeah.
right? Like I might get caught in my own feedback loop about like, this is how a creature is going to be and this is what it eats. It only eats plants or it only eats an animal. I might not consider for a moment until I draw a card that says, oh, you know what? That material might be stone. That material might be crystal. That material might be wood, right? It's like oh right, this is, and that could open up a whole new world of opportunities for us. Fellowship of the Tables is asking here, are you recommending that we not use creature cards for creating the people species of our world? And it's interesting because it almost feels like a slight follow-up question to, I think Forrest do earlier, was saying, I understand that creature in the deck means living things that isn't a person. I feel like they're almost two sides of the same coin for a question, and I don't know how, if you want to tackle that. I have some thoughts on this too, Peter, but please go ahead.
Yeah, so the primary purpose of the creatures deck is to in this like in the default base mode of using the deck. So if someone's learning it, my suggestion is treat creatures as non-people animals and non-people creatures. And as you become more familiar and comfortable, and especially if you are creating a fantasy universe where there may be sentient people that don't just look like humans or look like other things and may have animal traits, then you definitely can start to mix in the creature deck. And I have a few suggestions for how you can do that. You can combine them with factions if you want to look at like a particular like group or a particular group of people that share these like certain animal characteristics. You can do it with you can combine it with deck of worlds and just like designate certain areas as being like home worlds for certain people that have species traits. The thing that I would focus on is basically making sure that whatever people you're going to be depicting, um, think about them in all of their, I'm going to use the word humanity here, but in all the things that make them sympathetic and that make their experiences valid and true, and try not to just think of them as animals or less than human. Basically, like anything that you're going to treat as human really, or as a person, really treat with all of the dignities of personhood, including like their cultural perspectives, the way that their body might shape or determine their understanding of the world and their relationships with the world. So that is my recommendation. The other thing I would say is if you're going to try to create a person like species, double all the cards that you draw. So if you're supposed to draw one species card, draw two for every one of those prompts, so that you can choose the more specific prompts that are um, that fit with a sentient type species, because not all of the prompts are designed to work that way, or cues are designed to work that way. So you want a little bit of extra variety to choose from. And if it's one that you're supposed to draw two cards, draw three or four and choose, just to make sure that those specific connections that need to be fit in a certain narrow way still work and still make sense. And again, honor the personhood of the creature that you're creating. The other thing that you can do is basically when you're creating figures, you can draw a species card and apply a species modifier to them. So like this is a moose person or an elk person, or like this is a fungal person. Add that element to who they are, and then you can extrapolate from that person that there may exist others like this from the world and go from there. But you can apply that at the character level too.
I think with Forrest Dew and Fellowship of the Table, it was like one. I just had this moment when I read both of those questions where I was like, yes, and this is why we talk about breaking rules as well as having rules. And I think really at the heart and core of all the tools, like in the end, they're tools, right? Lore Masters deck, Story Engine deck, Deck of Worlds. They're tools for you to use to build a world and build the kind of lore however you see fit. And if you find that those cards will help serve that purpose in a different way, of course, build the rules. And maybe we just have some advanced lore builders here. I will, one thing I said to Peter when it comes to developing the guidebook and rules is like, as someone who's very logic brained, when I receive a game and I open it, I need to be told what to do from the get-go, or else there's a part of me that's like, I'm doing it wrong. I'm not doing it correctly. But what is creative? Like, there's no such thing as incorrect creativity, right? There's no such thing as right or wrong. And if we kind of assign that, it limits what we do. But I recognize that not everyone kind of can start over here. Some of us need to start here. And I think like the rule book, I guess, is a guidebook. It kind of allows us to build a foundation, and then of course we can explore past the foundation. And that's why even Peter said, right, like you can build like singular modules of something, or you can expand them as large as you want, or you could separate them out and like have it, kind of start a whole new module over here and eventually find a way to interconnect them, which is obviously why we've been talking about, you've seen, Peter's graphics about little tokens and stuff like that. So yeah, in a long-winded answer, rules are made to be broken. Or
Yeah.
what is it in the Pirates of the Caribbean where they say like,
Oh,
where they
more
keep saying like,
guidelines.
Yeah, they're more like guidelines
And
anyways.
that's why it's never been called the rule book. We've always called it the guidebook on the cover. Is that they're not meant to be rules; they're meant to be guides. And the only two rules are make something, and any rule that doesn't work for you or doesn't serve your creative purpose, substitute with something else. Like the end goal is to have you create things, not to have you follow rules. But to answer Fellowship's question, so in easy mode, where we're not using creature cards for people species, what cards would you suggest we use? Easy mode, you probably wouldn't. The only way that you might get there is I do believe there is currently a queue in the species deck and possibly one in the figure deck that basically says that connects them to a creature and makes them a creature-like species, or a person who has like actual physical characteristics of a species. That doesn't explicitly have to mean that they are of a particular like the term from the problematic term from D&D is race, and from a lot of other games. They don't necessarily have to be of a particular race, but they could just be that like they had that as a transformation or they're a shape. Like there's lots of reasons why they may have those characteristics otherwise. So there's a couple cues that bake that into the main deck, so that if you're doing it in easy mode, it reminds you that this is an option. But otherwise, that's not really reflected in easy mode, and that's not because we don't encourage it. It's mostly because there are enough new principles in this deck that just learning technically how to handle the cards and configure them is kind of its own process that requires its own on ramp. And easy mode is just all the basics that you need to know to be able to handle the cards. And if you're like a robot following an algorithm, create something using a consistent series of steps and procedures. And then everything after that is where we get into like the more advanced uses, and that's where like especially that level of creativity is explicitly sort of framed there as like ways that you can do that. But yeah, the main deck is only through specific cues that that like that kind of thing comes up.
Hmm. And this is probably a good segue into talking about the deck a little bit further itself, and probably leaning into making cues, because maybe some ways to answer some of your questions is to just show you a couple of examples. But in case there was other things that you wanted to talk about when it comes to the process of developing the creatures deck, do you have anything else to share? Since it's like, yeah, like all of the things you said about breaking rules and stuff, it's all part of your deck development process. So like, what was the process of developing the creatures deck specifically? I know you said already that we did not want to call it species, to lean away from the science of it, kind of allow a little bit more opportunity to think outside of the box.
Yeah.
And I know you also spoke about how, you kind of usually use, like, for the prompts, there's two land base and then there's usually something else. So what was the process in kind of coming up with all of those different, I guess, components?
Yeah, so we'll do a quick look at a card here. So yeah, the cards are all double-sided in Lore Master's decks. On the front side, you have these short primary cues, which are usually one word, and they just describe a basic animal type. So a bear, a ray, like a stingray, a mold, or an armadillo. And the backside has secondary cues, which are different sort of traits of the animal or backgrounds or connections that it might have in the world. And the challenge was basically trying to figure out how to um, to capture elements of all of the biodiversity that we have in our world and of Earth, and not just like North American-based animals, but really animals from all over the world, and their unique stories and traits, both on the front side and like these are base creature types, and then also on the back side in terms of like these are their traits, and then also to look at like fantasy has such a rich history, and science fiction has such a rich history of being able to create original species and original creatures. Of like how do you capture potentially magical traits of a creature, or how do you capture creatures that don't exist yet, or that maybe that we have an idea of because of fantasy, but that a dragon may not always present exactly as a dragon, or a gargoyle may not always be a gargoyle, or things that don't necessarily feel like animals but like a gargoyle that might be living constructs. How do we make sure that there are some options for thinking about animals that might take that form? So for the front side, the way that I ended up balancing this deck, and I did so many different configurations of this one. I shuffled this deck, and not just that, but the system of categories that I put things in so many times. But like I mentioned, the final one was one, sort of speak, generic creature, and often like in evolutionary terms, this creature is often um, not just like one creature, but like there's subspecies of it. It can present in different ways. So, and it's something that people have an instinctive understanding of, and it tends to be a little bit simple. So, bear is an example of like a more generic land creature that you could think of hunting or going about the landscape or doing things or encountering in like a very traditional way. And then there was often one like more specific morphology creature, like an armadillo, that comes with comes with more preconceptions about like its specificity. Like bears, we can imagine a bunch of different ways. Armadillos, because they're armored, because they have like one very specific body trait that kind of defines them, they're a little less flexible, but they give you more to start with, and that can be very good for people who like to be able to think broadly and have a blank canvas to work from. Where a bear, you could transform in a lot of different ways, and some people want something more literal to start with, and like an armadillo is specific enough that they're like, okay, I'm dealing with an armored creature that's this big, and they can think in those terms. So balancing general and specific, balancing uh, animals that everyone knows with animals that people might know less about. And then I often try to do one water-based creature so that if you are doing coastal things, you can have a water-based creature. Or again, the one of the notes on using the creatures deck is like you can always reimagine creatures outside of their normal habitat. So if you want to have a ray that flies through the air instead of flies through water, just think about how its body would do that. How would it generate that lift? Or maybe it's just magic and it does it with an energy field. Like
Think about Appa from Avatar.
yeah, exactly. And you want to be able to have those moments of like creating a magical version of something. And then the last one is often I find it's often the hardest one to use, but it's usually the most interesting. And again, in this case, it's mold. And these are usually non-mobile creatures that we often don't think about, that we can almost think about as objects rather than being alive sometimes. And I really wanted to challenge people to think about like fungus and mold are such a huge part of um, how everything in the world works. Bacteria are too, right? So if you are someone who likes to think about what bacteria exist in this world, and maybe if they form colonies that are large enough they become visible, how would people think about this weird living paste that grows on things? I wanted to have prompts that could like give access to that if people wanted to. And then on the backside, this was even more challenging because trying to represent like behavioral traits, chosen environments or preferred environments, relationships to humans, cultural meanings to humans, resources that are extractable from the creature if you are using it for resources or food or materials. If it has urban relationships or it's purely a like non-urbanized animal. What are some of the others? Oh yeah, like mating, child rearing, socialization of the animals, hunting behaviors of the animals, physical features and body plan. What is it shaped like? Does it have radial symmetry? Does it have bilateral symmetry? Like all these are really interesting questions, and I think that they're things that are my favorite thing is when you apply a trait from one creature that you didn't realize you only associate with that creature, and you give it to another creature, and all of a sudden something really interesting unlocks. Like there aren't really a lot of horned aquatic animals, right? Horns are a very frequent evolutionary feature in land animals. You see tusks in jawbone-based protrusions in water animals, but not necessarily horns. So if you start giving horns to water animals and you think about how they'd have to operate in the water, that becomes like a really interesting thing. It could be used. They could almost be shaped more like fins, right? Like a more a stronger, less cartilaginous, more marrowy kind of formation. And then you start to come up with these really interesting modifications. And the thing I want to stress is like I love thinking about these things in terms of evolutionary biology. You do not have to. You can just give a seahorse some horns, and holy cow, we have a horned seahorse. That's really cool. The visual on that is just really cool, and that can be enough for like let's just do it. And like now I'm thinking about if I have a horned seahorse, I'm making those horns out of something coral like. Like I want it to fit the ecosystem visually. And now so we're off to the races with a cool cue that like changes the way that the seahorse works. And all of a sudden, the horns can now be like a form of steering it if it's a mount. Like you can start to build off of these things. So like let yourself just have fun mixing them around. Don't think too much about you can figure out why it makes sense later if it's just cool to start and you like it and it feels good.
I like that you brought that up though, Peter, because I think sometimes we can get really caught up in trying to explain something for fear that we're seen as doing something incorrect. And it's like, well, we already are inventing something so far outside of the realms of our imagination. So you're not incorrect already. And it reminds me of I actually remember when I did a course on science fiction, more literary like study as opposed to creativity. But when we were studying and we read the book Neuromancer, which I think was written in the 80s, the first criticism that a lot of people were giving in the class was like, the technology is wrong. Like the way this person was describing computers and how computers work is wrong. And I'm like, well, there was someone in the 80s trying to invent a world that was substantially in the future. And now we're reading this book in 2008. Well, I think he was creating as much technology as he would within the limitations of what was happening in the 80s, and the world is fiction anyways, so and frankly, like, that was not the point of the story, right?
Yeah,
Like
and I'd say like the underlying technology, the not necessarily like the like how does someone plug in, but the underlying technology was pretty prescient. Like, yeah, I feel like the technology may be wrong, but the basic understanding of how digital life could change the way that people interact and the way that like um, economic systems work was like pretty on the money in my when I look
Yeah,
at it.
I think the thing is like in the end we are all suspending our disbelief, right? We're suspending our disbelief to participate in a particular universe that is outside of our own because we want to and we want to feel immersed in it in some way. And I think like having some, having tools at your disposal to craft out the lore so that just doesn't seem so left field is one thing, but it also you can also have the opportunity to create it and I guess like backfill later or two. The idea of creating all these prompts is for you to challenge and craft out and flesh out the lore so it becomes the believable space that you want without necessarily I guess like ascribing or subscribing to preconceived notions of a belief system. So I don't know. I feel like I'm almost talking out both ends of my mouth here. It's like look, building a world is super important because you don't want to have something that is not grounded in anything, but you don't have to kind of get so hyper, I guess, obsessed in a way because in the end you're suspending your disbelief.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think
Yeah.
knowing, yeah, and it's a fine art, like knowing when to go deep and when that deep work becomes distracting from like the larger work of building a world in a like big full way and not getting too down in the details. And you don't like sometimes, yeah, sometimes the questions are answered later. Sometimes they're answered by other cards that come up later. Like you create a faction that has a relationship to this animal, and all of a sudden that feature of it makes sense. Um, and yeah, so I think, yeah, I think that like being curious but not going in with like the assumption that I need to know the answer right away is like a really good attitude to have in many different kinds of creativity.
Yeah,
um
absolutely. Okay, well, I guess we should build some cues,
let's
build
do
some
it.
creatures. Let's
All
make some
right,
creatures.
I'm gonna fire up the old demo cam. Just give me a moment
The
here.
demo cam.
The demo cam. Okay, we are going to build a creature. So let's go ahead and draw one to start, and we'll have you vote in the comments for which cue you'd like to use. So, are we going to build a horse, a parrot, an anemone, or a scorpion?
I will full on say after talking about sentient paste, I was like an enemy. I was like, since we're talking about sentient paste here, but I'm curious to what people would want to vote on.
Yeah. I I will say I was recording some improvised. Releasing some YouTube shorts of just like trying to cut down the creative process of one cue into 60 seconds, and I did Scorpion for one of them. Literally recorded it 2 days ago, and I think it's going to come out in the next few days on our YouTube channel. Um, so Scorpion I did recently, and it was a lot of fun, and I love Scorpions. But I never mind doing it again because I like to see how is it different this time. So we've
It
got
was funny. I was about
Scorpion
to
versus
say, and
Anemone.
we had two scorpions, and then suddenly we got another anemone. And as the votes are coming in, I think I want to take a quick moment to say we're just under $4,000 away from unlocking our next stretch goal, which I believe we're going to donate another 10 decks
That would
to
be amazing.
educators, which is super super important. Like this is something we've done for every single campaign, and when we talk about like teachers and underserved, I think we've had the opportunity to send quite a number of decks to all over the world. So not just within North America, but to a lot of places in Asia as well. And I think like I don't know how it's like in certain area, like all I can only speak to being in Ontario, but I would say that if we want to get a little bit political here, since we're talking about world building in Ontario, I think teachers have had it pretty rough. Educators have had it rough over the last few years, and the opportunity to kind of give back a little bit means a lot to us. And we have a lot more stretch goals that we're actually hoping to unveil later on this week, and we would love for you guys to help us get there. So we're super close to the next stretch goal. More stretch goals coming. If you've been following us all over the discussion board, there's things that we have been working on quite intensely behind the scenes that we're hoping to release out with some of our stretch goals down the line too. So yeah, definitely stay in touch. I feel like people are moving more and more into an enemy. No, I feel like it's like the anemone scorpion war now.
We could we could just go straight into creating a hybrid. Um, that could be fun. But no, I think we should.
What
I think
one thing at a time, one thing
yeah,
at a time.
one thing at
Well,
a time.
maybe we can come back to the scorpion. I'm gonna go since I said anemone. I realize I've been saying
You can tie
anemone this
break.
entire time. Yeah, I'll tie break it.
You can tie break it
Anemone.
on an enemy. Cool. Okay, so an enemy, just in case you don't know, sea anemones are they're related to coral, but they're not in the same family. They're like sort of lateral to it. They're technically predators because I think that they do largely eat by capturing floating prey. Are there mobile ones or are they purely stationary?
I don't know.
I'm just gonna check because I want to. Well, we don't necessarily need to know. We can do the things. We can work with the things that we know about it, and I do think that
I
they can
also like how
sort of
some people
form
are I
colonies.
like how I literally looked it up and oh, I realized they're also a plant. Fascinating. I didn't realize there were
Yeah, they're named
apparently
after a land plant. Yeah,
yeah, okay, hold on. I'm gonna actually have to look up the animal of it.
yeah,
Let's
sea
see.
anemone.
Can they move? They
Yes,
attach
they
to
are mobile.
substrate. They are broad foot-like base. However, they can move short distances at will by pulling up its basal disc and creeping or swimming in a clumsy manner to a new spot.
Okay, so yeah, mobile but not known for mobility. But again, any of these traits are things that we can change and play with as we create our version of the creature. So let's give it some traits. We can give it a background where it is hunted by a particular faction. We can give it a trait where it's predator or prey of another creature, so we can start placing it in an ecosystem. We can give it a trait where it's a migrator or hibernator. This like slow 1,000-year migration of anemones could be really, really fun. Um, Trait where they're bloodless or cold-blooded, or yeah, back to our background, hunted by a faction. So you can go ahead and vote for faction, predator, prey, um, migrator, hibernator, or blood. Just type blood if you want the blood-related prompt. Are any of these speaking to you, just out of curiosity, while votes are coming in? I'd love to know if there's any of these pique your fancy.
Well, the fantasy person in me likes the idea of work at a faction because it's that whole like affiliation or kind of like animal familiar type. It also is hilarious that it would be an anemone that would be working with a
Oh,
faction.
hunted by a faction.
Oh, hunted! Dang it! I suck.
Yeah.
See, this is my brain. Like I'm talking about working. I think my brain. This is me. Too, this is my Freudian slip telling the world that I've been working far too much. Hunted by a faction
I do
that
like to give it
changes
an
it for
enemy
me.
showing up in like a suit and tie to like another
Yeah,
day at the office.
or just like I don't know, like they can't leave the waters. They like all live in tanks and just like hang out at a faction. And it's like yeah, it's. I don't know if hunted. You guys feel like I don't want the environmental lover in me doesn't like the idea of like I can almost see it being a broad sweep thing because like I feel like they don't move super fast. Bloodless, no. Let's see. Uh, uh, uh.
Let's see. We've got migrator. Vote for migrator, faction, predator prey, and blood. So that's 2 for predator prey. So we are going to place it in ecosystem, which is kind of fun because this is the creatures deck. So we'll get to look at another creature. We'll draw that now. So go ahead and give a vote on if it hunts primates. And again, we can make either the enemy non-aquatic, or we can make this creature aquatic, even if it normally isn't. So primate, an ant, a plant, or a monitor, like a large lizard. I'm kind of getting into the idea of like aquatic primates right now, because that's the one that I least associate with going in the water. Although, like a water ant, like a kind of hive insect underwater, would be kind of cool too. Oh, or sorry, and I've been thinking of it as the an enemy being the predator, but if it was the prey of um, something, where like primates, there's like a primate that like eats it extensively, or like a plant that eats it extensively,
Or
that'd
like
be really
an
interesting too.
ant because that'd be kind of gross. Like if like it was like ant swarms.
Yeah, we've got 1 vote for ant, 2 votes for ants, sea monkeys, monitor. Why don't you go ahead and tie break for us, Maroki? Are we going to do monitor or ant?
Well, since I talked about ants and their weird, gross swarming things, let's do ant.
Cool. And I like this pitch that we just had in the chat here. Um, Coral cleaning water ants as prey is really interesting to me. So,
Oh.
oh yeah, so it might be that they like eat coral growth or like trim or hedge coral growth or like the sort of the gardeners of the coral garden, but that specifically inside these coral patches, you have these anemone that are a bit more mobile, a bit more predatory that like feed off of them and make sure that the ants don't overeat the coral, and so it becomes this like monitoring system of like them all eating each other. I think that's a lot of fun. Cool. Let's give our anemone another trait here. Trait is a background where it's no longer found in its original habitat. A trait where it is highly intelligent, which would be really interesting. A trait where it has night vision, or a trait where it does not age. So let's go ahead
I mean, if
for
you want to create, if we decide to make them a little more sentient or sage-like, the idea that they don't age would be fascinating if they're like sort of like helping balance out the ecosystem of a coral.
yeah, it'd be interesting, especially if yeah, if they are on a different life cycle than the other elements in this ecosystem, it's just interesting because like what happens if an unaging creature's population suddenly drops? Because unaging creatures tend to have lower reproductive rates because they otherwise they will overpopulate. Um, it would be
Although we
interesting.
have quite a number of votes coming in for highly intelligent. Oh, we got
Highly
one from
intelligent.
they don't age.
Two for don't a or three. Two for don't age. Two for three for highly intelligent. Okay, so I think the highly intelligence have it. All right, so we have, something that I always find really interesting is as like humans and as a species ourselves, like so much of our understanding of what intelligence is based around certain traits that we see in our own evolutionary past, right? Like the ability to develop language, to work with tools because we have hands, um, to write things down and be able to store memory outside of the body. Like these were all major breakthroughs for human evolution. But a creature that doesn't necessarily have hands, that may not have speech organs, that can't express or show the signs of intelligence in the ways that we traditionally recognize would be really interesting. Like, what does it mean to be a really intelligent creature that is like has like the ability to problem solve, but doesn't necessarily can't show that in the ways that we traditionally recognize it. I think that would be a really, really, really interesting thing. What does it mean to be like a really big brain without a mouth or hands, or traditional hands? Um, Love that. I think it's a really interesting question. So we have our highly intelligent anemone that feeds on the ants that do the squirrel thing. I mean, like one thing that's interesting, intelligence is often associated with ambition in evolutionary biology. That like the more intelligent thing becomes, the more it starts to expand into other evolutionary niches because it can get the upper hand, and we think of it as like a advantage of like this is how this creature is winning. What if this very intelligent anemone? What if its intelligence is not like how to get the one up, but it's how to keep the ecosystem in balance? What if the thing that it's really good at sensing through its sensory organs is like, is the water pH right? Are there too many ants right now? Is there too much coral? Have I been eating too much? What if their intelligence is much more framed around not like getting more, which is very much how human intelligence shows up in evolutionary history, but is tied to getting enough and everything getting enough, and like this more like sustainability focused intelligence or mindset, I think would be really cool. And like coral is a network, right? I don't exactly know how anemones would be adjacent, how an anemone would behave adjacent to that, but there is a possibility that there is this more networked organism. Um, I think that would be cool or interesting. That's my pitch. All right, let's give this anemone more traits. The next thing is going to be like we get a thing and it's like very aggressive and selfish will be like the cue, and that whole vision goes away. Background. Okay, so this was something that I was going to do later as its own dedicated prompt because you don't need to draw this card to be able to do this. But hybrid with another creature is a really fun one. So I might suggest that we save it for later, or if we want to like dive right in and just do a hybrid creature right now, we can do that too. We can give it a trait where it has a proboscis or snout. We can give it a trait where it has sexual multimorphism. So
My
basically,
goodness.
it could have two or more sexes, and each of those sexes could express really visually differently. A note on this: sexual dimorphism is the term in biology for like say spiders, where like say the female spider is much bigger than the male spider, and I did not want the prompt to be limited to like there are only two sexes. So multimorphism was the term that I went with, and I like the idea that you can have this broader spectrum of sexes represented, just in terms of biological sex. Trait communicates via gestures, which would be really interesting because again, anemones they have tentacles, right? So you could have a really complicated tentacle language that's done through gesture or poise, especially if these are intelligent creatures. And communication is one way that intelligence often expresses itself. But yeah, give me a vote for hybrid, proboscis or snout, um, morphism, or gestures. I love this pitch from anemones can be kind of like the elder race of the world. I really like that. We is highly intelligent and unaging adjacent? No, they're not. Well, even if you tuck one Q, you can always like just remember the other Q and be like, I also think that this is true about it. That's definitely something that you're welcome to pull. The other thing is dun, 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 it could enter a period where it slows down when there's not enough corals. Yeah, so Hibernator is one of those other cues that we're like again pulling on inspiration from, and I do find that I often have residual inspiration from cues I didn't use. But we could have this thing where it is an intelligent hibernator. It knows when to shut itself down so that it's not taking too much or drawing too much. All
We
right,
have a
what are our
lot of votes
here?
for morphism here.
Morphism, gestures, morphism, gestures. All right, we're gonna do sexual multimorphism. So yeah, here's a question for y'all. If an anemone does not necessarily so I think that they do work with like sperm packets in real world biology. Oh, they also breed asexually by breaking into half or into smaller pieces, which turn into polyps.
I was gonna say they seem like absolutely a creature that would fragment.
So they're like their reproduction in terms of how it relates to sex is fluid, right? Like it works in multiple ways. So I love the idea that we don't have to be tied to like a sexual binary here. We could have creatures that like could like just like literally creating a new sex, like a new category of sexual characteristics and interactions, could be a thing that it does when it separates or breaks up. Like it could literally be an expanding multimorphism of like how many sexes there are. It could just change whenever one of them decides to like or not decides, but like there's some kind of biological impulse to be like, oh, I'm going to be a new thing now. In fact, that as the highly intelligent, like super sustainable thing, if it's starting to overpopulate, it could just create another new sex. Its response to we are reproducing too quickly, create another sex. There's now another factor that limits the number of potential sexual pairings, slows down the reproduction rate, and that's one of the ways that it keeps the ecosystem in balance is by like voluntarily complicating or diversifying the just sexual diversity and the number of potential pairings. I think that could be like a really interesting thing for this like elder steward of this world. They break apart.
Oh, I
when
like
alone,
this
but reproduce
when
sexually when they
alone.
congregate. Yeah.
There adds like there was almost like a very melancholy element to that. Like if like the world was sort of in balance, and there's less of them around, and like if they're highly intelligent, it's like they can break apart when they're alone, but because they're highly intelligent, they reflect on that a lot. Doesn't mean they feel like an intense loneliness.
Yeah.
When it happens, like do they feel more alone when they break apart? Like it's like they can break apart to multiply, but they actually are weaker and not as strong as a result. So they can't just rely on producing asexually.
Yeah, that would be that's such an interesting idea. And even just the question of like what does it mean for a creature in with this kind of social apparatus around it? What does it mean for such a creature to be lonely? And like is there an emotional component to that? Are all things that I find really interesting. Like how do you know if an enemy's sad?
Oh God, Jesse, I'm lonely. I need me to entertain me. I will not dive down that one. I feel like the very lewd part of me has many jokes, but I will not digress from providing our final
Not on a live stream while we're like unlocking decks for classrooms and schools.
No, go ahead, Peter. You gotta distract me from myself.
Another prompt. Here we go. So the last trait, background, is the symbol of a faction, which would be really cool if it was like a stewardship faction that's like dedicated to keeping the world safe or in balance. Trait, it has an unusual hide or skin. trait, it communicates via pheromones or electrochemicals, which would explain that like communication. How does it communicate without speech apparatus? Um, and trait, very short or long lifespan. We have not officially made it unaging. That's been an unofficial poll, so we could like make that canonical via
We could
cards.
like
But again,
lock
yeah,
in its
you could.
lifespan.
Yeah. Womp womp. How do you know if an enemy's sad? Surely it turns blue.
Uh,
All right,
are
so
we? Are people gonna stab Maroki with puns and jokes like today as well?
oh yeah, yeah. So two things that I want to do to razz Maroki today. So one is please keep coming with the really bad puns. I love it. Maroki hates it, and that makes me like it even more. The other
Ah,
thing, so this Friday's live stream, Friday at
3
3
p.m.
p.m.
Eastern
3 p.m.
time.
Eastern
Mhm.
time. We are going to be creating a setting using Lore Master's deck that we are then later going to run a D&D one-shot adventure in. It may not be a super structured adventure. It may be like more of a series of scenes of roleplay with a very small party in 5th edition. Maroki has not played D&D before, and I would really like to peer pressure her into doing it. I'm going to, taking aside the bit for a second, I'm not going to make Maroki play D&D if she does not want to. She absolutely will have a say in this. But if you would like to encourage her to play her first game of D&D live on camera, in a weird world that we make together, just let us know in the chat. Give some encouragement because I think it'd be really fun. And I also fully respect that she may not want to play her first game live on camera. I've already been thinking about how to structure it so that it's not so mechanically driven, which means that you don't need to memorize a lot of rules to play. You could just do it as an improv exercise. And Maroki has a background in theater. She is a performer, so I think she'd do great. Do it. Yes, join us, Maroki. So just gonna highlight some peer pressure again with a like. You do not have to do anything you don't want to. I just would like to give you as much encouragement as I can because I think it'd be a lot of fun.
I'm not. Don't give in to peer pressure. Just do what they say right off the bat. Right?
Perfect.
It's true, and you just acquiesce right away. This reminds me when I was fishing last week. I was saying how I would never acquiesce, and I was like stubbornly fishing for in like an empty spot for a long period of time because I was like never acquiesce, never. But I actually am not necessarily opposed. I just think people will have to be a little bit forgiving about the million questions I may ask about it, and that I may not approach D&D with the same experience that a lot of D&D players probably would. So just you saying that as a precursor, symbol of a faction, symbol of a faction. I feel like that's what everyone wants it to be a part
Yeah,
of.
let's do it. All right. Let's figure out our faction, and then that'll seal off this prompt, and we'll start a new one. Or what we could do is for our hybrid creature, we could pull out the ant and turn that into our intentional hybrid creature. Actually, I might do that. I like expanding the web. I like being able to expand the web and build on what we've got. So here we go. Is the faction that is using it as its symbol? Oh, this is such an interesting These are all really interesting. Okay, so a covenant, which you can interpret any way you like. That can be like an agreement. It could be like really focusing on the coven part of it, like more of this like a magical group that has met or a circle that has met. And that makes sense with like an agreement with the enemies of like how they operate. A core, which would be like a military unit or some kind of deployable unit, not necessarily like for combat, but a core that works together on this that like maybe solves problems in the way that the enemy might. A senate, where you have a governing body that's trying to think about the world in this sustainable way, and not for ourselves, but not just for me, but for us. What decisions do we make? And then a monopoly, which can in most contexts be a very bad thing, but if it's a monopoly that's based around a like fully benevolent species, it's kind of the benevolent dictator question. If you have like one power group that has all the power, but they're good, what is that bad? These are all so interesting, and this is the first time that I'm feeling like a very deep analysis paralysis of like I want it all.
This is why we have a democracy here and allowing others to vote and decide for us what the analysis is. I'm getting yes. Fellowship of the Table is very very flattering. Thank you. I do appreciate that very much. Well, they say in the acting world, the people who become the best actors are those who draw experiences not in acting training but in everything else. So there we have it. Covenant. I think people overwhelming votes for Covenant
Covenant,
here.
yeah. I love how Covenant is a very like it's so of the factions, like very very quickly talking about the factions deck, the factions are sometimes like structures. They are sometimes structures that are also like buildings or physical spaces, like a circle or an academy can be a physical space, as well as a group. And then sometimes they're like abstract nouns, like covenant, where a covenant can be the agreement, but not refer to the group. And I like that it pokes at different ways that people group and organize. And covenant is one of those abstract ones where we often don't think of a physical form that it takes. It's more of an agreement. So the faction might be less about like an organized group and more about like a way that that people who participate in a certain system of belief in the world see themselves as being part of this agreement that like we don't take too much. That intelligence is not about how do I get more, but how do I get it? How do I get enough and make sure everyone gets enough? I think that's a really cool. I think there's so many ways you could go with that in the world. And on another day that we weren't doing creatures, I would pull out Covenant and find out more about the Covenant, and we'd build that prompt out. But instead, I think let's make an ant.
Yeah,
Um,
let's make an and this is an and I think I know talking about hybrid creatures is on our docket, so this is as good time as any to try and make a hybrid creature out of the ant.
So let's do it. And what I'm going to do quickly is just review. So the hybrid system is basically part of this larger system of when you want to build custom prompts. So at any point building out this prompt, rather than drawing symbol of the faction, we may have been like, you may have had just the glimmering of like, I really think that this species could be connected to faction in an interesting way. And rather than drawing a card, I am going to dedicate a card pairing where I don't draw and use a secondary queue. I decide what the connection is and I draw another primary queue and I plug it right in. Because like I think that these are really social creatures and factions are social and I know there's something there and I want to explore it. So the hybrids are basically doing that, but doing that with the creatures deck specifically. But you can do that with you can use the same principle for the other deck. So the relationship that you do when you're pulling a primary queue instead of a secondary queue can be anything that you define. But I usually, in the guidebook, my plan right now is to give a list of suggestions for the types of pairings that you might use. Again, reminding you that you can decide any relationship between those two cards. But you can always substitute a queue for a fixed relationship with a faction, where it's a faction that trains or uses the creature. But again, if you think like, oh, this creature could be a symbol for them, or an inspiration, or they could be conservatives of it, you can define that relationship differently. You can always draw a figure card to have a figure who has a relationship with this creature as like a pet or a steed, or like an army of them. You can always draw an event card where the creature served a role, and that can be like from as a disease bearer to a like creature used in rescue efforts to a battle creature. You can always draw a location where the creature can be found that can define its like habitat or a prominent colony of it. You can always draw an object that either is made from the creature or that appears in the creature's natural defenses or body plan. So if we have our scorpion and we draw a spear, like this more spear-like straight tail could be an interesting way to think about the scorpion. Or you draw a spear on like a bird, and what does it mean for a bird to have a spear-like beak or spear-like talons or another or like an apparatus protruding from it that's more spear-like? So you can do object pulls. You can pull materials and just define a creature that the material produces or feeds on or has some other relationship to. So sometimes it can be fun to just draw a card type, substitute that for drawing a different queue. And what we're going to do is do that with creature and creature, where we can either create a like a predator prey relationship, or most often, and the one that I think is most fun, is create a hybrid creature. So right off the bat, I'm going to pull another creature type, and we're going to morph this ant into something else. And I usually recommend drawing 2 and choosing your favorite. So there's going to be 8 choices here, which I know is going to split the vote. Oh wow, here we go. Okay, so the ant could be. Oh, let me rearrange this a bit. The ant could be hybrid with a moose, which would be really interesting. A reptile, an anglerfish, a fungus, a tyrannosaurus, a bird, a camel, or a sea star. And keep in mind hybrids of aunts and uncles. Yes, perfect. More like this. More like this.
I see nothing.
So yeah, so you can pick any of these. And again, you can take as many or as few of the traits of the secondary species as you want to. You might just pull that the sea star is the shape, that we have a star-shaped ant. You might just pull that the ant has like a fungus living on it or a fungal layer and it's a symbiote. You might pull that it just has the antlers of a moose. You might pull that it's scaled. A scaled insect is actually, that's now my favorite. You could give it wings, and those wings, rather than being insect-like, could be bird-like wings, or could have like more of a hollowed-out structure. Camel, you could have it have like these fat repositories where it stores food for long periods, and it can be this animal that can survive like longer starvation periods. Um, Tyrannosaurus would be fun, like just a Tyrannosaurus ant, like maybe a big set of jaws, or we just give it tiny front arms or something. Um, yeah, and we can as much as or as little as you want. All right, so we've got birds and bird wings, ability to fly. I got to vote for Tyrannosaurus. See if anything else comes in. Are any of these speaking to you, Maroki?
My brain is trying to hybridize them and decide what is either interesting or comical or just like realistic and or
Mhm.
like the most, putting reptile scales on an ant doesn't transform the ant too much, and it kind of keeps it a little safe. When I was thinking about Tyrannosaurus, I was also thinking about scale. Like, are these ants substantially larger than we are imagining them to be? And if they are prey of the sea anemone, does that mean that the anemone is not as small as we're thinking? That they're actually giant sea anemone and they eat giant Tyrannosaurus ants, right? Like
Yeah, you
that.
could just
It
apply
kind
the
of
scale and like no, you could just apply the scale of the Tyrannosaurus to the ant. That would be
Yeah,
pretty
it
wild.
kind of and it actually it like shakes up the entire core queue that we have as well. So,
Yeah. Well,
oh,
Fellowship wanted to see what we do with Tyrannosaurus. Oh, they do have a tribrid. Pulling
oh my
multiple of these would
god.
be really interesting. That would be intense. All right, so far we have no two votes for the same thing. Tyrannosaurus is the one that you were thinking about, so we could pull that. I like the camel pitch, and I think I actually know how to fit it into the anemone. So that's gonna be that would be my pick. But do you want to cast the final vote? Another vote for Moose now.
I'm okay with doing camel. I think the other thing too is just for the sake of time and just like simplicity and wanting to show all the things we want to show. Uh, I think like just something that we know we can work in,
Mhm.
like like you said with the camel deposits is probably the best way to go for now. But I think it's very it's kind of showing the really imaginative opportunities that changing it up or really shaking it up could have.
Yeah, yeah. I absolutely agree. Cool. So my pitch here, by the way, is that they have these stat deposits that the camels have. I almost kind of want to just imagine like ants with fur too. I think that could be interesting. Like a furred insect. You've never seen it before. Can't think of a particular reason why not. And If the ants can store fat and energy for later, they have no incentive to stop eating, which could explain why keeping their population in check is really important to keeping the health of the whole ecosystem in check. Because if they get full, fine, metabolize some of that into their like fat deposits or into their other storage deposits. Just keep eating, which means that they could easily just like a horde of locusts like just deplete an entire zone of the ocean. So the anemones like really do need to be present as these custodians to make sure like okay, the ants will not stop eating. How do we eat enough ants to keep all things in balance? Cool. And you know what? Let's turn this. This is an interest of time thing. Let's turn this hybrid into our. Let's do this with more of those pulling a primary queue instead of a secondary queue. So I want to see. I want to figure out a material that these ants produce. I think that would be an interesting thing to find out. So I'm going to draw 2 material cards, and we're going to vote on one of 8 materials. Very quick side thing, because I'm a big Dimension 20 fan, and really enjoyed the sequel season to Crown of Candy, The Ravening War, recently. Yeah, Brendan Brendan Lee Mulligan, the DM of Dimension 20 on College Humor Dropout, has done a lot of talks about like in a world where all the conceit of Crown of Candy is that it's a world where it's all the food groups and everyone is made of food. There are people who are meat, people who are cheese, and people who are vegetables, and all of them eat food. And people have been like, but does that make them all cannibals? And he's like, you're a meat thing that eats meat things. It's like that. But it definitely does start to make you think about food categories. Sorry, that was a little personal aside, just because I've really enjoyed um, Ravening War, and the new season of Dimension 20, I believe, premieres tonight with the Dungeons and Drag Queens, which looks like it's going to be so good. So I'm just very excited. Okay, Peter's entirely selfish, divergent side quest is over. Let's pick ourselves a material. So we got 8 options here. They can produce a milk, a pigment, a crystal, a foam, a meat, a type of horn, a rock, or a sap. All of these work for me. All of these are fun, and I'm curious to see where the votes come in.
Yeah, and maybe just to clarify, like I said, Moroki's the rule follower here,
Yeah,
and I
please.
think we're kind of throwing things off the cuff for a little bit for the sake of time, and I make the assumption that in a normal circumstance, if someone is following the guidebook, I guess piece per piece, they would have likely pulled some sort of secondary trait that would have prompted us now pulling the materials to talk about like what it produces or something of the
Yeah,
sort.
what
We're
we're
kind of
doing right now.
imagining that
Yeah,
a secondary trait was pulled that prompted this, but this is us just kind of
yeah. Think of it as
throwing the
manual override is almost what's happening, right?
yeah.
Like the deck on autopilot, you pull the secondary cue and then you pick between the options. Manual override is like, oh no no, I want to know what kind of material an ant camel would produce. I'm curious about that. More than a prompt being given to me, that's a thing that I want to explore, and you're basically overriding the card pull and deciding this is what I'm going to explore.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is what we are doing. And yeah, there'll be a section in the book that kind of gives advice on how to frame that and structure that, so that you're not constantly paralyzed by options, but that you can go off-roading whenever you want to take that manual override. And that's what we're doing. So I decided on the manual override of material because it's what I wanted to do. I was curious about. We have insect characteristics where like bodies produce like chitin, um, and there is a sort of kind of blood to them. And then we have like mammal characteristics where we have like fat and fur, and blubber, and it makes me really wonder like what kind of things could this creature produce. I'm trying to remember if ambergris. It was in the list of ones that I wrote. That I can't remember if it made it into the final deck because it might have been just a little bit too narrow, but I think it's in there. If not, it may end up making one of the promo cards. Um, but yeah, just about ambergris here. Okay, so we've got
We
vote
have
for
two
pigment,
pigments.
foam, pigment, fat, which is not on the cards. So the other thing you can do is just like decide these things aside from the cards. But I do want to use the pull here. Ambergris fun pull. Okay, so let's go with pigment then. Um, a pigment that their bodies produce. So this is where like you fire up the imagination engine and you can look at like does it have a chitin layer underneath the fur that like when it's ground up you get a color from? I know that like the color that goes into grapefruit juice. Oh, this may ruin people's days. One of the prominent ways that you get the color that goes into grapefruit juice and a lot of dyes in that pink range is I believe it's a ground up chitin insect that can be mass harvested, or it is certainly an element that goes into a lot of the pigments that are used for dyeing fruit juices that color. Pigment would be a really fun one there, and I think I'm just thinking of that color range because it's basically exactly the color of the materials cards. Um, so yeah, we could do that. It could be a pigment that's used from like melting down the fat and rendering the fat into a kind of like paint, or it could be a pigment that's like done from like I don't know, boiling the hair or something, boiling the fur. So there's a lot of options there. Right now, I feel like because we're doing the fat stores, that like maybe it's a pigment that's made from breaking down either the fats, or maybe this thing because it is an insect, it stores it more in like starches, and it's a way of like you can like boil down the starches and make like a particular kind of pigment or paste from it. And that makes sense because these ants can keep eating and keep building whatever storage sack or cavity they use. So you could end up with a lot of it if you just let them feed for a while. And then let's do. Oh, I forgot. You still do usually want to do a wild card to start off. So this normally would have been pulled at the beginning, but we'll vote for one of these 8 options. So our camel ant here can be pointed, sinuous, inevitable, perplexing, which definitely has some strange properties, um, distinguished, charitable, unstable, or transforming. So again, that's pointed, sinuous, inevitable, perplexing, distinguished, charitable, unstable, or transforming. I find them all really interesting. Transforming is probably the one that I think most about because of like ants in like larval stages. So the idea that maybe it goes through different transformative stages could be fun. Um, unstable is interesting if it's like behavior changes and it can become very erratic or something when it has too much food or too little food. Pointed, like making it having like a more pointy shape in its body plan. Sinuous, giving it more of like a curved shape. These are all really fun. All right, we've got inevitable, unstable, 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 distinguished, and sinuous. So I think we're going with unstable here. So I like the idea that its behavior can become very erratic depending on its food stores. Um, yeah, it'd be interesting if like its starvation mode as it goes into hibernation, or is its starvation mode that it just gets really hungry and starts to eat a ton, or does the more food that's present, the more it wants to eat? Because it's like now the getting's good, and I can just store this up for later. Maybe the transition between phases is unstable. Oh, that's really interesting. What if it like reverts to its pupal form when it doesn't have enough energy? That could be really cool. Unstable transformations. So all those are all really fun options. I like unstable. It's a good pick. And then what I'm going to have you do for the last prompt is let's vote on one of the primary card types that will just do another manual override pull. So we're going to pull a primary card and decide what its relationship to the ant camel is, which means that you can vote between faction, which would be interesting because then we see. Oh, oops, sorry, talk to this under. That'd be interesting because we could see if there's a faction that's like opposing the covenant that is attached to this camel ant in some way. So we could do faction. We could do figure. So there could be somebody who like researches these or harvests these or has a colony of them or has like a plan involving them. We could do an event. So an event that it could happen because of them or that they contribute to or that their population exploded as a result of. We could do a location. So we could decide where these things live. We could do an object that's part of their body plan, and those would be the options to pull. So go ahead and vote for faction or figure, event, location, or object. In the meantime,
Oh, I saw it. Oh, I saw it. Oh, I saw it. I was trying to ignore it, and I was hoping you wouldn't see it. My goodness.
Just a can't. Unstable in terms of population also makes sense. Sure, eats a lot, but the population's very wildly. True, true. All right, we have event and figure and event. Event, stampede. Well, we've got 3 for event. So I think that's probably going to be a majority. So let's do our last poll here. And this will be the last one of the live stream. So we're going to pull 2 event cards, and we're going to decide what the relationship between this event and the ants could be. The ants could be a catalyst from it. They could be, their population explosion could have resulted from it, but we're going to apply an event to them. So is this event a victory, a famine, a crisis, a vortex? Oh, I have a fun idea for vortex, but I have a fun idea for a lot of these things. A purge, an eclipse, a plot, or a rift. And as always, feel free to attach a little suggestion of how you'd interpret it to your vote. You can just vote plain, or you can be like this, and here's why. You're always welcome to provide your rationale if there's one where you're like, "Ooh, I have an idea for that." Camelant, 'tis a very silly creature. That is a wonderful Monty Python and the Holy Grail reference.
I don't actually have I watched Holy Grail many years ago. I've only ever watched it once.
It is definitely one of my overwatched in my youth movies. I think I found like a $1 VHS of it at like a Rogers Video or a Blockbuster that was shutting down, and then just like watched the tape until it could no longer physically hold itself together.
I actually never watched Monty Python till I think it was probably 14 or 15. And I think it's because a lot of my friends were quoting it in high school and they kept telling me that it was really, really funny. And I either rented or bought Meaning of Life. I was rather horrified by it, honestly.
Yeah, it's a disturbing film.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know if, then like in hindsight, it probably should not have been the first one I watched, but it was Meaning of Life. It basically ruined Monty Python for me, and I proceeded to never watch any Monty Python ever again. And the only Monty Python I ever consumed were either bits that people would send me that they knew was their like greatest hits and they would find it funny, or I would learn certain quotes from it. So I knew there were things that it has been so folded into our pop culture that I would know was Monty Python reference. And it wasn't until I started dating Eric. So it would have been like 5 or 6 years ago. Then he was like, you need to watch Holy Grail. And then he showed me Holy Grail. So I was in my late 20s by the time Holy Grail ever entered my life. And it was kind of like, okay, that wasn't so bad. I can I can
Yeah,
continue on.
their movies are very unstructured, and Holy Grail or like Life of Brian is probably the most structured of them, and definitely I would say that like Meaning of Life is probably the least structured. And definitely like that I would not recommend that as a first Python experience. Um, and yeah, yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot structurally, and also like in terms of content, like it is. Yeah, it's constantly deking, and then also constantly finding like new ways to be unsettling and disturbing and
It's
irreverent.
also one of those, yeah, it's also one of those moments where I claim my ESL-ness. It's like, hey, I'm the child of immigrants and I actually grew up super ESL and I didn't really speak English properly till I was at least 10, and my childhood was filled with Miyazaki in Chinese long before any of yous got Miyazaki in North America. So that's my win. That's my little win right there.
Well, Monty Python does not make sense in its native language, so I can only imagine that you had a barrier to that, and it's like, what is this is also ridiculous. What part is the joke? I can get that. Okay, hold on. Let's tally the votes here. We got
Yeah.
double for Vortex, and that is definitely the one that I'm curious about. So the thing I was imagining was at some point I saw a video of like ants kind of in a feeding frenzy around some spilled, like I think it was a spilled sugary drink or like ice cream cone, where they're all following each other to food, and they ended up following each other in a circle and forming this like really intense like spinning vortex around this like sugar spill. Um, and I like the idea that when the ants get hungry enough and populous enough, that they might end up in this like follow towards food chain, and that literally can form a whirlpool or a vortex through its movement in the oceans. That was the pitch
Oh,
I had.
Jesse's saying vortex causes a riptide, so they're like,
Yeah, and this is
yeah.
like now a thing that land starts to experience, right? Where like even if you aren't like someone who's constantly going into the water, all of a sudden you're seeing like this huge ocean movement that doesn't normally happen, changing like your fishing livelihood because it changes the way that fish are migrating. Like everything starts to be connected and affecting you. I also really liked this pitch from Will that they could migrate in large group like butterflies seasonally, and that they might migrate around tidal vortexes. So when there are these big ocean currents or movements moving around, that's when they move. So they could be in the fallout of these regular events that happen. That's how they could end up doing the relocating, which again would make the enemy's job interesting because they have to, as a creature that's mostly stationary, they have to figure out how to get to the place or trust that their colleagues in these other locations will be able to manage this new population suddenly dropping into town. Um, so that is all really fun. I like because we're dealing with this creature that can hit a very big scale, possibly physically from growing and continuing to feed itself, and also in terms of population, because it doesn't have like a stop point for reproducing. It'd be really interesting to see like what is the effect of that scale in terms of this vortex. I think that's really fun. So just to do a little like closing summary of what we've created here, we have this highly intelligent species of sentient anemones that is like unaging, has lived for a very long time, and that its intelligence is not used to expand into new ecological niches or to like get the one up on things. Its intelligence it uses for this like sustainable way of keeping all of the ecosystem in balance. Um, they prey on and specifically try to make sure the population is in balance with this species of camel ants that have fat stores and fur. And the enemies are sexually multimorphic, so they can create new sexes, and that's one of their ways of balancing out their sexual pool and making sure that they're reproducing at a rate that makes sense for what they pull from the ecosystem and the way that they monitor it. And the camel ants, I still like the idea that they have these big fat stores. Maybe those body segments that ants have can get more and more bulbous and grow, or they have like a pouch on the back that continues to fill up as it fills up on food. I think it'd be really cool if they had these little fine furs. Because I think ants, if you look at them in a microscope, do have really fine little hook hairs or something.
Yeah.
So that just becomes a little bit denser and more furry. They're the starch or fat in their body can be boiled down to produce a pigment, um, which could be like anyone who lives in the area where these things migrate to. Will probably like that's going to be the default pigment that they use for like dyeing their clothes. So actually, and especially if we have a vortex thing where these things migrate, maybe you see that all of a sudden there's this big rush of that pigment appearing in an area, and so you can actually like if you were to do archaeology on your world, you could track where the ants migrated to because all of a sudden all the clothes that were produced for this 10-year period were all dyed the same like very orangey color of this rendered starch and fat from the ants. You can actually like track their progression through the way that they impact how clothes are made or how textiles are dyed in those areas. And that's our little miniature ecosystem that we made here together, and that was so much fun.
Yeah.
Murky, do you have any closing thoughts to share?
No, I mean, maybe just like as a this is the logistics mind in me. If you're like me and sometimes need help keeping track, make sure this is like, this is usually an awesome time to pull out your notebook and
Yes.
usually
Yeah.
like make sure you track changes, I guess is the official terminology, but like, take a moment to just sort of jot down all your thoughts around crafting this particular lore just so that you can ensure that it ties into everything if you necessarily don't want to leave all your cards out hanging about, because if you're like me, I probably will swipe them off the counter accidentally at some point and then be very, very mad at myself. It's like that whole thing. It's like the Photoshop image that you forget to save, because back in the days of when autosave was not, or recovery was not a thing. So yeah, definitely take a moment to write that. I think this is a really great example of showing how you can follow the kind of guides provided to you through us. If you are using primary and secondary traits to guide your whole process. So if you don't, if you sort of just want a little hand holding sounds is one way to put it, but if you want a little bit of hand holding, a little bit of guidance, or just if you're like me, like I said, I like following things by the book. That the first cue around the sea anemone does that. And then if you already know there's a way that you want to pursue something, if you're like, no, I really want to, kind of hybridize this ant animal, or I want to see, and now that you know it's a camel, you want to see what it produces. There's other ways for you to create the creatures you want without necessarily using the guide. So I think that's like an awesome, I think this is like a like 2 3 really great examples of how you can create a creature, and not just creatures too. Obviously, like a lot of these are applicable to all the different decks that are within the lore master's deck as well. That's why you're the lore master.
Yeah, very much so. The basic guidelines are there, and I apologize. My dog has seen someone go by the door and is now barking maniacally. But yeah, you are the lore master. The goal is that those basic guidelines teach you how to use the deck, and I think that those guidelines are especially good if you're just like curious to what the cards will give you and present you, and then you can do those manual overrides when you start to know, oh, this is what I want, instead of I'm open to whatever the experience that comes in is, and you'll discover all kinds of fun and cool things.
Yeah.
Um,
So I mean, if you're interested in learning more about the deck, and like I said, if there's other things you would want us to discuss in our upcoming live streams, throw them in the comments or throw them in the discussion boards. We'll be back on Friday at 3 p.m. to look at how we can create a D&D setting, or if we want to be a little bit more broad scope, like D&D or some sort of RPG setting with the deck, of which then I'll get a chance to play it in the following week. And actually, to if you are someone who hangs out on Twitter, we're also having a Twitter party tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. So if you look up Story Engine Deck on Twitter or use hashtag LoreMasters, you can join the conversation and ask more questions about the deck, and come up with ideas together. So there's lots of opportunities to participate with us as we continue on through the next few weeks of the campaign together.
yeah, so definitely let us know what you're keen to get more of a look at, and we'll make sure to bring that in. Okay, and the other thing I was going to remind you is, yeah, if you have a chance to share the campaign link, like word of mouth is everything to us. We would really really
It
appreciate
absolutely
that.
is.
So if you
More
can
than you ever
share more,
think.
yeah, we would really
Yes.
really appreciate that. And then to answer one last question, just because you asked about my dog, and I can never help myself. Yes, I have. My dog has appeared in my homebrew D&D campaign as a really lazy fox that lives in this library that's on the coast in this very Italy and Mediterranean themed area. Who's like supposed to be the guard of the library, but really just sleeps and gets fed treats by people who come to visit it. And his name is Bobrego Cacciatore.
Oh
Um,
my goodness.
so that's yes, I have built lore around my dog.
Do you like naming your creatures, Peter, around like some sort of, I don't know. I realize that as I say this, it's not always around, because your dog's named Oben around whiskey, and then I realized that I was like, is food groups the names of choice for Peter's creatures?
I definitely often think of. I've thought of a lot of my pets in terms of like what food are they like. And yeah, so the other thing is cacciatore means hunter. It was a hunter's type of sausage because you'd make it from whatever game you could get your hands on. So cacciatore means hunter, which is fun for like a fox type creature. Just
Yeah.
this particular fox creature doesn't do any hunting. He's just super lazy. And I thought that was like a fun little twist. And then yeah, Bobrego is just a silly Italian sounding version of one of Oben's nicknames, which is Bobin. We call him Oben or Obi Bobi or Bobin. Or you know how like pet names just become taffy that you start to chew and stretch into weird shapes.
Oh
At
my
some point,
god,
it
that's such
became
a great metaphor.
yeah, yeah. So this was very
Or
an extreme version of that. Yeah,
simile, I should say. That's my I swear I did an English minor. Simile, not metaphor. I think I just like using the word metaphor a lot more. I know my sister's dog, his name is Marty, and I call him Goo Goo, which is not related to Marty whatsoever. I literally just call him Goo Goo now, and it's gonna get to the point where he's gonna forget his name is Marty.
yeah, yeah. I
So
definitely, yeah. Will go days without calling my dog by his actual name. I know actually one last question to end on. Yes, all of our live streams end up on YouTube. If you go to Story Engine Deck on YouTube, there's the videos tab, and then there's also shorts where you can see the sort of quick 1 minute world building creations we're doing, and you can also see live. It'll have the records of all of our live streams are there. And if you missed the deck launch, if you missed us doing wine pairings with lore, all of those are available to come and watch afterwards. So we do hope that you'll come and join us later if you missed the live stream.
yes. Okay. Well, on that note, I think we're going to take off, but thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. Thank you so much for your support on the campaign and for spreading the word. And we will see you all live very, very soon.
Yeah, awesome. See y'all Friday.